Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the fourth session of this conference, A Modern Teaching Profession: Compensation, Representation, Preparation, and Evaluation. It's sponsored by the Program on Education Policy and Governance here at Harvard University, where I serve as Associate Director. Before we get started, just a couple quick details. Logistical matters: this is a webinar and it's being recorded. It will be posted later. The three previous sessions videos are now posted on our website for folks to review again. Because this is being recorded, this is a matter of public record. Please also understand that as a webinar, we want your participation, and the way we will be able to achieve it is if you ask your questions, if you type them into the Q&A panel. We'll review those questions and do our best after the presentations to ask as many of them as we can. It is my pleasure at this time now to introduce the program's director, Professor Paul Peterson, Henry Lee Shattuck Professor of Government here at Harvard University. Paul?
I'm delighted to welcome you all to the conference on a modern teaching profession. Over the past 3 weeks, we've held sessions on teacher compensation and teacher assessment, but today we're focusing on the teacher's role in civics education, a controversial topic. A recent survey of teachers reported that 65% of them say they limit discussions about political and social issues in their classes. Well, I'm not sure what limit means, but can a good civics education occur if controversial issues are ignored? When civics is taught, should teachers follow state and district guidelines, or should they express their own views? What do students need to know to have a good civics education? To discuss these issues, we have three distinguished educators on our panel. Michael Hartney, co-moderator of the conference, is going to introduce the panel. Michael is a Hoover Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. He's an expert on teacher representation and education policy. Michael, would you please introduce today's panel?
Sure. Thank you, Paul. First, we'll have Paul Carrese. Paul is a professor in the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University and a senior fellow at the Jack Miller Center. Then we'll hear from Morgan Polikoff. Morgan is a professor at the Rossier School of Education at the University of Southern California, and recently author of the report, A House Divided: What Americans Really Think About Controversial Topics in Schools. And finally, we'll hear from Robert Pondiscio. Robert is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and a former New York City public school teacher. And with those brief introductions, I'll turn things directly over to Paul Carrese. Paul.
Thank you very much. Thank you to Paul and your team. Let me see if I can get my slides. Are they showing?
Yes.
Okay. It's a delight to be here and to address this very important topic. My father was a public school teacher. It's probably one reason in history and as it was called back then, and then social studies and civics. So probably one reason I became a professor in political science interested in these topics. I'm going to be talking about a national study published in 2021, Educating for American Democracy, that I was invited to be a co-lead on, a co-author of, and addressing the aim of that study to prepare states, districts, teachers to address the controversial topics of civics, in part by suggesting that controversy is a feature, not a bug, of American civic life, and it ought to be a feature, not a bug, of American civic education in K-12 schools. So this is the title of the study of Educating for American Democracy. That's the link where you can find the full study, a report, and what's called a roadmap. I'll talk about that teachers can use, as well as states and local education authorities. Excellence in History and Civics, and here are the funders, the U.S. Department of Education and the National Endowment for the Humanities, and then the lead institution. Circle is at Tufts University Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement. iCivics, the Safra Center at Harvard, my department, the school at Arizona State University. And as the top banner says, 300 plus different scholars, educators, students, civics and history practitioners were involved in a 1.5 almost 2-year-long study. We were trying to capture the spirit of the American motto itself, out of many one, e pluribus Unum. And I was there with a beard on the left, even though I was the one conservative. I should have been on the right. Was invited by Danielle Allen of Harvard and Peter Levine of Tufts and others who knew me to be an intellectual academic conservative involved in the study. We were looking for, as the slide says, a cross-ideological national consensus approach to teaching an American civic education, American citizenship preparation in K-12 schools. We came up with a plan to emphasize both the what to teach and the how to teach of civic education. And as you'll see in the future slides, we centered on the idea of teaching, even in the K2 grade and 3-5 grade band, teaching on the basis of questions, preparing American citizens and aspiring American citizens to be curious and questioning, and that in turn is meant to prepare them for debate and for discussion. So these are the 7 main themes. If you start at the 1 o'clock position, you can see the civic participation was the first theme, and that's been a big emphasis in K-12 civics education and even in higher education. Civic engagement, civic participation, but across the other 6, there's plenty of civic content, civic knowledge, historical knowledge, and that really is the horse in this study leading the cart, so to speak, of civic engagement and civic participation. We then talk about America's geography and history. The 3rd theme is We the People. The 4th at the bottom of the wheel is a new government and constitution, the Declaration of the Constitution, our constitutional order. Then institutional and social transformation across 250 years. The 6th theme is a people in the world, America and its relations with the international order or lack of order. And finally, contemporary debates and possibilities. Those are the 7 main themes. We develop what we call a roadmap. We decided on the basis of the American principle of federalism that we were not, as it says at the bottom of the slide, we were not going to produce a national curriculum or try to impose some national mandate. Under federalism, the states and local education authorities set curriculum, and then a great deal of latitude is given to districts and schools and teachers. So we designed a roadmap that could be used. We are one republic. There should be national studies and national consensus efforts about American civics and history education. But the roadmap metaphor was meant to provide a map that could offer different destinations, or even if common destinations, different ways to get to the same destinations. As I mentioned, it's an inquiry framework. I'll talk about what the design principles are to prepare for, again, this theme of debate, discussion, disagreement in American civic life. There are strong elements of content, as I mentioned, but again, we are trying to prepare for the 6 to 8 grade band and the 9 to 12 grade band, where there can be more emphasis on depth of knowledge and depth of capacities for discussion and debate and comprehending the complexity of American civic life and American history. So that's a bit of an introduction to the study. And again, I hope you will look at the website, and I'll provide that again in the final slide. But now a few slides on why this matters. It's just a fact, as Paul Peterson said in his introduction, that everything is controversial in American education, and civics and history education is also controversial. I would also say it's a fact, what I learned from 18 months or more of working with teachers and people out in school districts and education providers, is that civics and history and social studies teachers feel completely abandoned. There's almost no top cover, and they're constantly exposed to controversy if they try to do more, but they're not given much support. And the evidence of lack of priority or lack of support in these next few slides suggests paradoxically why this is very important. So the national test scores are only getting worse on basic civics knowledge. This study is almost 10 years old now, but we have no data that this has changed, that there's 1,000-to-1 spending ratio coming from the federal government in terms of funding on STEM toward versus funding for civic, social studies, history. So in the post-Sputnik era from 1957 onward, the enormous priority for federal government spending in education has been toward math, science, STEM, to some extent basic reading, and declining support for civic education. Just one sample of many. You've seen polls like this and survey results like this about young people. America itself is underwater with the younger generations. I can remember a poll taken a few months after Vladimir Putin invaded Russia, which included the question, if the United States was invaded, the way Ukraine has been invaded, Putin invaded Ukraine. If the United States was invaded, would you fight? Would you stay and fight the way the Ukrainians had? And for the under 34 group, the majority said no, they would not stay and fight. So we have a patriotism, civic attachment, as well as civic knowledge question. The stakes are very high. I like to quote this remark from Lincoln in 1838, suggesting that a lack of civic education was leading to increasing violence. And this lack of awareness of this problem was a kind of national suicide, he said in 1838. So I do think we are in a Sputnik-like moment. My co-authors on the Educating for American Democracy study thought that. But the difficulty is that we are internally a kind of danger. Our lack of attention to this issue, the need for both civic knowledge and civic virtues. So I need to wrap up. Just a few points about the roadmap. It can be used by teachers at the curriculum level, but also by states and education authorities for instructional standards. We do talk about reflective patriotism and the challenge of building many building into one, e pluribus unum. There is a whole separate pedagogy guide. This idea of design challenges, how to address complexity and prepare students for debate, is worked into the 7 themes, and then there are 5 design challenges. Just quickly to talk about how classrooms can develop both civic knowledge and civic virtues by, especially in the older grade bands, preparing students for divergent views, disagreement, debate. And then finally, just some information. You can find this on the EAD website, steps that you can take as a particular teacher or a district. And educator resources is a section of the EAD website, voluminous amounts of information. And then there again is the website itself, and maybe we can put that into the chat. That's it for me.
Great. Thank you, Paul. And just a note that we will post slides and links later on, because we've been getting some questions in the chat about that. Okay, we will turn things over to Morgan if you want to share your slides, Morgan.
All right, thank you. Maybe not used to being on a panel where I might be the only non-conservative. That's a very rare thing in education. Delighted to be here to talk about the teacher's role in civics education. It's a little bit funny for me to even think about talking about civics, because up until a few years ago, I wouldn't have said that I paid that much attention to this topic. I think a few things have changed. One, I think clearly there's just more attention these days to curriculum issues in U.S. schools related to civics. That's, I think, a trend that's been going on for the last several years after a period of sort of relative détente on curriculum issues. That seems to be front and center. And then 2, I've come to realize about the importance of politics and education policy, and it's become more of a central part of my agenda. So, and I don't think it's, to echo what was just said, I don't think it's a surprise to say that democracy is in crisis, that public trust in government is very low, that partisanship is very high and rules everything, and increasingly, I think, has crept into just about every part of education policy. Again, an area where I think for a long time, partisanship wasn't quite so central. And, public education clearly has a role to play in solving these crises. I think, of course, we should also acknowledge that public education alone cannot solve them. And, as we increasingly cleave along partisan lines, I think schools are really one of the last places where people with different beliefs regularly encounter each other, where, contrasting ideas are put head to head. So clearly education is going to play an important role here. So I'm going to report some data from the report that Michael mentioned. And actually, we had a follow-up report that came out earlier this year on Americans' views on what you might call controversial topics, or you might call, potentially contentious issues. We don't like to call them controversial topics anymore. But and a lot of these have to do with civics. And I'm going to make a few high-level points about sort of what Americans believe and value. So first of all, Americans believe that civics are among the most important purposes of education. So we asked about a range of potential purposes, and you can see here civics came in third, behind only teaching children subjects like reading, writing, and math, and offering free education to every child. And this was true among Republicans and Democrats. People view civics as an important purpose of education. But they're intensely divided as to whether education should embrace diversity. Out of all the civics related, out of all the purposes we asked about, this was the one with the largest partisan divide, with Democrats overwhelmingly in support of this purpose. It actually came in third among Democrats, and it came in dead last among Republicans, teaching children the importance of embracing differences. And we think that this value is really at the root of a lot of current partisan disagreements about what should be taught. Americans are genuinely divided about what and when to teach regarding civic-related issues. We asked about race-related scenarios, and we also asked about LGBT-related scenarios, and there were large partisan divides on both. You can see here I identified some to focus on. That on the race-related scenarios, there was actually more agreement than you might expect about historical race-related issues, things like civil rights and slavery and things that happened in the past, but more disagreement about what I would describe as current-day racial inequalities and our responsibilities to address them. So things like about how policies in the past benefited white Americans or what to do about them now, about discussing ways that white people benefited from slavery, discussing the ways criminal justice negatively affects Black and Hispanic Americans. These are areas where we see large partisan divides. And we see even larger partisan divides on LGBT-related issues, some of which, touch on civic topics. So things like discussing same-sex marriage rights or LGBTQ Americans' contributions to history. But we see enormous partisan divides, whether we're talking about elementary school or high school in these kinds of scenarios. And beyond disagreeing, Americans also don't agree on how to resolve disagreements about what to teach. There's, the sort of so-called parents' rights movement, I think is people are on, there's a lot of people who are on board with the idea of parents' rights. It would be hard to argue against parents' rights. But then the next question, which is, okay, well, what do you do when people disagree within a classroom? Because obviously in just about every classroom, you're going to have parents who feel differently about a topic. People don't really know what to do. And I think that is, that shows that we haven't really thought through this very much, right? So we asked about how this should be handled, and people's, the most popular answer, about a third of people said teachers or the principal should make a final decision. Another 30% said the elected school board should decide. The point here is that there's not consensus on how to deal with these issues. And that's, I would say, fairly obvious. As was mentioned earlier, teachers are fearful of discussing potentially contested topics, and that's true whether you're in states where there are such restrictions or whether you're in states where there are not. But that said, teachers, not surprisingly, are more fearful in the places where there are restrictions on these topics. And I think that teachers should consider carefully what topics they teach and how they teach about them. We don't want them to be fearful. We don't want to drive people out of the profession, but you should think about what you teach and whether it's appropriate for the children in your classroom. And in part, that's because teachers are themselves divided. And I think that's especially true on LGBT-related issues, but it's true to some extent on race-related issues as well. So you can see from this survey of Americans, this was, I believe, Pew, from this survey of American teachers, that large proportions of teachers don't believe that children should be learning about a particular LGBT-related, gender-related topic. And even a quarter of teachers will say that slavery is part of American history, but does not affect the position of Black people in American society today. So there are serious divisions among teachers on these topics. So what do I think about potential solutions? For starters, I want to say, what Paul discussed before, I think is great. I think we need models out there that folks can adopt and implement, that states can adopt and implement. I mean, it will not surprise you if you know anything about me, that and what I advocate for more generally, that I think state departments of education should play a leading role here. We need clear guidance from state departments of education about what topics to teach and when. The teachers need to be provided with high quality, easily implementable instructional resources, that we give coaching to district leaders about processes to manage disagreement, that state departments or state legislators make clear to all what issues are on the table and where are we going to allow for local control and what things are non-negotiable, and ensuring that a diversity of perspectives is valued. Now, one thing I will say about this is, because of the way that the nation works, that means some states are going to do things that I don't like. And I don't really see a solution to that, right? The federal government is not going to be on my side on a lot of these issues right now anyway. And that's the reality, is states control education, and in particular, they control standards. I think that we should have clear goals in mind, whatever approach we pursue. Things like, we need to be able to live and work with people we disagree with. We need teaching to be doable. Teachers need to not be under attack constantly, nor burdened with catering to each individual child and their parents and their whims. We need to respect parents' authority while also protecting children who are often marginalized. We need to teach children things in school and not be distracted by adult nonsense. These are clear goals that I think might undergird whatever approach we take. We should attempt to build consensus where possible, and there are programs out there that can help, programs on negotiation and consensus building. We need to be able to respectfully disagree, and we need to also work together to come to solutions. We can find existing areas of common ground. For instance, one thing that we found in our survey is there's actually widespread support for the idea of children reading books written by people from diverse backgrounds, because those books provide different experiences and perspectives. And that could be a starting place for consensus. And I think realistically, there has to be a pressure release valve, and opt-out is something that I think, especially on certain topics, probably does need to be allowed, parent opt-out. But I think that we also can explain its downsides and encourage people not to use it. And we've shown in our own surveys that that language describing the potential negative effects of opting students out makes adults less supportive of that. And I think that local schools could do that too. And it needs to be fairly contained. So these are just a few ideas that we have coming from our survey, strategies that states should pursue. But I think to end, I just want to emphasize, this is really a state responsibility. State departments of education and state legislators need to be doing things to support teachers in this area. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Morgan. Robert.
Thanks, Michael, and I'm honored to be here today. From time to time, I've looked at the mission, vision, and value statements of America's largest public school districts. These mission statements demonstrate shockingly little concern for the role of the public role of citizen making. As a former teacher, I can assure you that no teacher has ever taken down their district mission statement when deciding what to teach. But I think it's still instructive to look at these documents. The published statements give us insight into what the men and women who oversee our school districts are thinking when they ask themselves, what's our role? What do we do here? So what's interesting is when citizenship is mentioned, it tends more often than not to occur in the context of global citizenship. The word patriotism, for example, appears in literally not one of the mission statements of our 100 largest school districts, not even once. Even more shockingly, neither does the word America or American. I don't think I'm wrong or overstating the case to suggest that public education is drifting from its founding ideals and becoming increasingly estranged from its stakeholders and that public purpose. Our schools are supposed to be in the business of attaching kids to their country, community, to civil society, but sometimes it seems they're more interested in critiquing, not attaching, but attacking country, community, and civil society. That's a very strange business for publicly funded schools to be in. It's kind of like an organism devouring its host. Benjamin Rush, one of our first great educational theorists, observed that the time to develop what he called strong prejudices in favor of our country is during the first 21 years of life. In 1786, Rush wrote that, quote, a general and uniform system of education will render the mass of people more homogeneous and thereby fit them more easily for uniform and peaceable government. Now, if Rush were alive today and tweeted those words, he would be canceled, of course, for wanting to make Americans more homogenous. But remember that the founders wanted us or warned us of the threats that factions posed to our infant republic. But look, there's a crisis of trust in institutions. That's obvious. But in the case of the American public school, it's less commonly observed that that lack of trust is a two-way street. When teachers are asked, for example, in whom they place a high degree of trust, they say their fellow teachers, their administrators, their unions. Parents tend to be at the bottom of the list of folks that teachers trust. And it shows. My AEI colleague, Yuval Levin, has written voluminously about how the institutions that were once molds of our character have become platforms for performance. That's true of our politics and the world that I come out of, the world of the news media. But I think it's also true and writ small in our classrooms. Look, to be candid, I can offer no data. I know of no such survey. But were you to ask America's nearly 4 million public school teachers to describe their roles, my strong hunch is that vanishingly few of them would describe themselves first and foremost as state actors or public employees. When I reflect on my own time as a New York City public school teacher and later teaching civics at a charter school in New York, and when I reflect on my graduate school coursework, I was expected to be many things, an agent of change committed to teaching for social justice. At no point did anyone ever say to me, with what with the benefit of hindsight now seems like something I should have heard early and often. Mr. Pondiscio, you've been hired as a public school teacher. You're not a free agent. You work for the public. You're a state agent, a public employee with enormous influence over a captive audience of other people's children. Some of those people live like you, think like you, vote like you, pray like you. Some of them have beliefs and values that are completely different than yours, but you're responsible for educating all of their children. What I wish had been said to me, it's an enormous responsibility. People need to trust you, even those who are nothing like you, especially them. You're not going to be successful if parents don't trust you. You're not going to last long if you look down on those people, if you hold them in contempt. So be humble, be respectful, be mindful of community sensibilities, especially in a community and a country that has people whose values and beliefs, and yes, obviously their politics are all over the map. I want to spend a minute speaking directly to one of the points that Morgan just talked about, where he noted that we are intensely divided as to whether education should embrace diversity. Specifically, he noted that wide gap between the left and the right on, quote, teaching children the importance of embracing differences. This is actually where I fear we are most at risk of being led astray by our good intentions as people who care deeply about the civic health of the country. In 2005, Karen Stenner, a political scientist and a behavioral economist, published a book called The Authoritarian Dynamic. It was an eye-opening, very sobering work describing the conditions that drive intolerance, including racism and political division. Her work concerns a particular type of person who, and I'm going to quote here, cannot treat with natural ease or generosity those who are not his own kindred or kind, because of deep-seated predispositions that neither they nor we have much capacity to alter. That's important. We don't have capacity to alter these individuals who comprise, according to Stenner, about 1/3 of the population and are predisposed toward authoritarianism. At the opposite pole are those who naturally interact well with all manner of people. The rest of us, she wrote, fall somewhere in between. Stenner wrote, quoting again, that most of us, or a third of us, are not openly averse to other people, but usually favor our own. Jonathan Haidt, a social psychologist at NYU who has collaborated with Stenner, summarized her insights thusly, and I'm going to quote again, "It's as though some people have a button on their foreheads, and when that button is pushed, they suddenly become intensely focused on defending their in-group. What activates the authoritarian impulse is what Stenner calls normative threat. She defines that as threats to oneness and sameness. So normative threat, that authoritarian button on our forehead in Haidt's image, is activated by a loss of trust in institutions and fear of change and an aversion to complexity. Now, ceasing to celebrate diversity in order to not trigger the intolerant obviously carries more than a whiff of enabling or appeasing intolerance rather than condemning it. However, if there's any institution in American life that enjoys the permission structure to make a virtue of oneness and sameness, it's the American public school. If you are an American of a certain age, perhaps 40 or older, you likely grew up and went to school in a vanished era of shared rituals, common culture, and a standard national narrative as a melting pot. You stood at your desk with your hand over your heart, you recited the Pledge of Allegiance every morning, you sang the Star-Spangled Banner at high school football games and whatnot. Look, I want to be clear, no one should feel nostalgic for a rose-tinted view of history that whether deliberately or carelessly excluded broad swaths of the nation's citizenry. But for all the lack of nuance in that melting pot as a central metaphor of American life, there is good reason to valorize the common narratives, symbols, and rituals inherent in that ideal. Moreover, and I'm thinking of Stenner here again, there's compelling evidence to suggest that we made a mistake in wholesale repudiation of the impulse to embrace a common identity as Americans. So that moral marker set down by the founders and the work of Karen Stenner in our own time strongly suggests, to me at least, a mission for public education that is aimed explicitly at social cohesion. So the challenge for our diverse, pluralistic, and democratic society, and of course a challenge that, as ever, falls most heavily on schools, the civic institution with the broadest reach in American life, is to blunt that sense that we're coming apart. But I trust you see the paradox, right? Common sense and good intentions suggest that exposure to difference, discussion, celebration of diversity should be critical to understanding and empathy. But if Stenner and Haidt and others are correct, that humane and intuitive impulse may be precisely the wrong one. So if we're determined to stand against intolerance, the most effective response is to make a virtue of our sameness. So this is precisely why, to go back to Professor Carrese, why e pluribus unum may be the greatest phrase in American history, powerful as any line in the Declaration or the Constitution. It recognizes America's diversity, the pluralism in our histories and cultures and beliefs, but it elevates our oneness, our unum. It says that we can't respect our differences while being, or that we can rather respect our differences while being part of something together. So I'll argue that only by inculcating in young people that we are in fact part of something together, this awesome American experiment, can we make people feel safe enough to tolerate our profound differences and to continually seek that more perfect union. So I hope all of this invites a thought exercise. As civic educators, are we wrong for all the right reasons? We seek to valorize diversity, reinvigorate our democracy, and close the civic participation gap. But I would love to discuss this today, if it is possible that despite our good intentions, are we actually making it worse? And with that, I look forward to the discussion.
Well, thank you all. Those are excellent opening observations. I have a question for Morgan to initiate the discussion, and that is, should we teach patriotism? Should we teach students that they have a responsibility for their country and should we have rituals in the schools that reinforce that sense of commonality and unity, such as Robert has just articulated?
I mean, I have no problem with that. I think that there are many of my colleagues would have problems with that. You know, should we teach about America's greatness while also teaching about its problems and shortcomings? I think absolutely. I think finding that ground that people are comfortable with, I think is, you know, the real challenge. And I think that not every state is going to equally emphasize one side of that pendulum, but I don't really see why we wouldn't. And, you know, but that said, you're going to find plenty of people who disagree with that and don't want to emphasize, you know, or want to downplay patriotism. But yeah, so I don't know. I'm not sure if you want me to represent my own view or if you want me to represent the view of the people I hang around with all the time at work. And so, but my own view is absolutely, there's no question.
Yeah, Paul, could I jump in on that? So thank you for the question, and Morgan for that answer. And this partly responds to some remarks that Robert made. In the Educating for American Democracy study, I was racing toward the end of my slides, but the design challenges were meant to capture these kinds of tensions in teaching American history and American civics in K-12 schools. And one of them, design challenge 4, I'm trying to remember it, it's about civic honesty. So that would be addressing in American history and American constitutional development, the failures to live up to the ideals of the Declaration of Independence. I'll phrase it that way. But it's paired with civic honesty. So design challenge number 4 for a teacher. How do you get across both civic honesty and patriotism? And we use the phrase from Tocqueville's Democracy in America, reflective patriotism. Tocqueville comes in around 1830, observes a new kind of patriotism in the New World. In the Old World, he's a French minor aristocrat, minor nobility in the post-revolutionary period. And he says, the Old World, we have a patriotism of emotion and passionate attachment to king or monarchy or mythic historical blood and soil, that kind of thing. In America, they do love America, these Americans, but they want to argue because America is about ideas. They have a considered or reflective patriotism. And that's what we tried to capture, weaving into history and civics education, that a public school teacher, that the study was focused on K-12 public schools, a public school teacher should feel a sense of duty to do what Robert suggested. The students are American citizens or aspiring American citizens, a duty to teach that America is a good thing. That doesn't mean America is a perfect thing. And in fact, America is a place and a thing of argument about what America is, what it means, and are we living up to our ideals?
I have a question that's born out of practicality, which is thinking about the difficulty that teachers are saying they're feeling, and some of the data that Morgan showed. You know, for the times where teachers are trying to push the boundaries to cover rich content and not shy away from this sort of stuff, who should they be looking to act as a bulwark to protect their ability to do that within the boundaries? I think maybe, Robert, this would be a good question for you. Within the boundaries of what you lay out, that they are state employees, is it their union? Is it their principal? Is it the school board? Who are they going to have to look to make sure that when they're teaching, they're still protected here? They're not college professors, obviously, but.
Yeah. I think Morgan and I would probably agree that we should be a little bit more clear on what the curriculum is. In other words, and this goes beyond civics. This is a problem for American education at large, where you have, functionally, 3.7 million teachers calling audibles, all day, every day at the line of scrimmage because for the lack of a curriculum. And nowhere is that more probably a problem than in those of us who teach history and civics. Look, I think maybe alone on this panel I has some experience teaching high school civics, So wrestling directly with these questions when I was teaching the senior seminar at Democracy Prep, a charter school based on civic education in Harlem. Look, this is a very old-fashioned notion, but I'm going to own it. And maybe because I come out of the world of journalism, this resonates with me. But I would routinely, my class was aimed specifically at teaching controversial issues. My goal for my students was for them to see that Constitution, for example, is not a dry and dusty document, but it's very much at work in their lives. So I purposefully structured the class around discussion of constitutional issues in the news. So I, combine my educational experience, my journalism experience to try to, create this seminar to invite precisely those kinds of arguments. But as a point of pride, I made a point of saying, look, this is not about my views. In other words, if you know anything at all about my views and my politics, and I failed you as a teacher, this is not about my views. This is about creating a vessel for you to argue and debate. And I hope I was successful with that. My own plea here, I suppose, would be a couple of years ago, I wrote a paper for AEI trying to revive the idea of standards of conduct for teachers. And these things exist, and in some states, they're part of teacher training, but they're probably, what was the phrase from Hamlet, a custom more honored in the breach than the observance. The best set of standards, the best code of conduct that I came across, ironically, was written by the NEA. In 1975. How many teachers get exposed to their own union's code of conduct? Well, frankly, even the NEA has kind of like disregards it now. But I do think that there's room to recover that as teachers. There's this kind of professional ideal that we should not have our thumb on the scale, that we should not, as I was suggesting in my remarks, indulge our priors in the classroom. Even we should hold ourselves as teachers to that high standard of really working very, very hard to center our students' views and not our own.
Can I just add very briefly, we surveyed in our 2022 survey, we asked very specifically about ways of presenting different views on a similar topic, and to what extent you covered, you supported teaching, for instance, about, Second Amendment rights and gun control. That's just one example. And overwhelmingly what we saw in our survey is people at the high school level want multiple views taught, multiple perspectives. And we didn't specifically ask this question, but there's other surveys that are out there that show that what people I think are most concerned about is this perception that teachers are indoctrinating. And I think that there are ways to construct sort of common, so basically I just want to agree with what Robert said, that there are ways to construct curricula that emphasize that it's not about presenting one side of the view, especially at the high school level, that it's really about allowing for diversity of opinion and engaging in those civic debates. I think at the elementary level, I think there's more concern about whether these topics are appropriate at all. And I think it depends on the particular topic. And I would look to something like Paul's curriculum to offer some guidance there.
Well, thank you, Morgan. I have to say that I teach Introduction to American Government to freshmen each year. I'm sorry, first year students each year. This is exactly what we try to do, is to get all this kind of discussion, sort of like Robert was talking about. And I don't find it that difficult. And that's really what students want. They really don't want, the worst thing in the world you can do is to start telling them what to think about things. But as long as you bring up both sides of an argument and let them discuss it, they're just delighted to have the conversation. So I have a question to Paul, though. Do we have enough time to do that? It's all wonderful to talk about this, but it takes a lot of time to reach this utopia. So you were talking about we don't have enough time for civics. But then the system wants to teach math and reading, so that's what you're really expected to do, especially in the elementary and middle schools.
Wonderful question. We had that in mind as we were writing the Educating for American Democracy report. And as it said in the slides, we talked to well over 300 people in different kinds of immersion sessions and study groups and subcommittees. And we were trying to write the report for multiple audiences, including state legislators, state departments of education, district superintendents, school boards, as well as down into the school level, the person in charge of social studies, civics, history teaching, all as again, this national consensus effort we were making. You know, what Morgan is doing, Checker Finn has talked about this kind of work as well. Start from some points of consensus, and maybe there can be a consensus about teaching diversity of views, as long as there also is some anchor in fundamental civic knowledge, constitutional knowledge about America. But again, the report is meant to be read, and the roadmap read and used by a range of audiences to try to come up with consensus across all these different stakeholders to say that we do have a civic crisis in America. We do have a disintegration of our civic culture happening right in front of our eyes. And couldn't different points of view and different stakeholders come together to say, we've got to find more time, we've got to find more resources, we've got to review our state standards, we've got to review not only the standards, but the support and actual implementation capacity for teachers for those standards. So it's a brilliantly written report. I highly recommend everybody listening to take a look at it. The report and then the roadmap.
So thinking back, say 40 years to, well, about 40 years to when E.D. Hirsch dropped cultural literacy, and it becomes this flashpoint where the debate really back then, both on college campuses and probably filtering down to high schools, was the content of what was being taught. And so demands for expanding, the way that we taught English or history to be inclusive of other groups. It seems like that was then, but this is now. And what you see now is it feels like there's genuine disagreement about not just whether something should be taught, but this expectation that the school district is going to take my side on it when it presents the material. How can teachers and just educators more generally navigate that environment? Because the whole point Hirsch was trying to make, of course, was that you're trying to make the curriculum relevant and exciting to people by not shying away from the content. And yet it feels like today people it's not just a debate over the subjects matters you're talking about. It's where are you coming down on them? Are you an ally or are you an opponent?
Yeah. I'll start, given that I'm kind of an unapologetic E.D. Hirsch disciple. And Michael, I guess I'll push back somewhat in suggesting that most of Hirsch's work is really about language proficiency. In other words, this is not Hirsch coming down from the mountain with a curriculum on stone tablets and saying, thou shalt learn this because I said so. I mean, there was a reason his book was titled Cultural Literacy. It has to do with the way language is used and background knowledge and the assumption that literate writers and speakers make about what their audiences know and how comprehension, language proficiency requires that we all have the same basic stored mental furniture in order for language proficiency to work. But look, you're absolutely right that there's a civic education dimension to this. One of his least appreciated books, I think, was called The Making of Americans, and it really kind of talked about the civic applications here. I guess my answer, and I hope it's not overly facile, is it's no teacher's job, no individual teacher's job to create the conditions under which we engage in these kind of discussions. It's really a job for school districts and administrators. So I guess my recommended fix would be if Morgan's data is correct, and I assume it is, that Americans are saying, hey, we want schools to be in this business. Well, that's job one. We need to listen to that audience. Our stakeholders want us to be in this business. And then two, it's up to school districts, either school boards or administrators, to create the cultural conditions within the school that makes that doable. I would personally argue that that would include saying, hey, look, our students are going to, your children, our students are going to discuss controversial issues, but here's that code of conduct. Here's how we're going to go about it. Here's the professional development we're giving teachers to enable them to valorize viewpoint diversity. No teacher should be doing this on his own or her own. And when they do, then you get to that fear that Morgan's data surfaced.
So, Paul, and then maybe Morgan, you may want to comment on this as well. Who is the biggest threat to the diversity of discussion in our civic education programs in the country? I hear on one side the problem are the conservatives. There's something in Morgan's data set that suggests that they don't want certain issues to be talked about. And then I hear on the conservatives complaining about DEI and the conformity that's being imposed on thinking about certain kinds of issues. So both sides are attacking the other side for being really the problem. So who is the problem? So Paul, you want to respond to that?
They each have a point, but that means that each of them are the problem. And the design of the Educating for an American Democracy study, as I mentioned earlier, was, I'll phrase it this way, center-left academics in Cambridge, Massachusetts, who conservatives would think of as Marxists, right? But center-left academics, Danielle Allen, a historian at Harvard, Jane Kamensky, Peter Levine from Tufts, and then from the center, Louise would insist that I say she's from the center, Louise DeBay from iCivics. They reached out to me deliberately, a known intellectual academic constitutional conservative. They wanted me as a lead author of the study precisely to get over this polarization among the professors, among the education experts, in the educational community and establishment, to say we need to provide a model of a national consensus effort that, and if you get bother yourself to work through that report and through the roadmap, you'll see evidence that we were trying to walk the walk. There are phrases and ideas in there that are difficult for conservatives to swallow, and I was attacked by name by different conservatives in different national publications for having been a mere Trojan horse, the one conservative who was giving top cover to all these Marxists in this national study. And yet there are phrases that are difficult for left progressive people to swallow, that students should consider. Why did the Declaration have a phrase like the laws of nature and nature's God? And the phrase reflective patriotism, right? That America, and the report actually opens with ideas about patriotism, right? That is not, as Robert mentioned, and I think Morgan would agree, the words America and the words patriotism do not often show up in political science departments and universities, or in history departments, or in education schools, teachers' colleges. And so they don't show up in our public schools. And that was one of my contributions, to have the word American in the title of the study, to balance and qualify democracy. So we tried to be a model of a better constructive path forward, because there is a doom loop that we're in. We are in a moment of serious crisis. I'm with full sobriety using or invoking Lincoln, talking about national suicide from 1838. We're not in as bad a situation as the 1830s, 40s, 50s, but we're not in a good situation, and it's only getting worse. And so if reasonable people can't be adults coming to the table together to try and forge compromises about making more time for civics and history education, but on the basis of consensus and compromise, then our situation is only going to get worse.
Any comments, Morgan?
I mean, I find myself agreeing too much. I'm a very boring panelist. Listen, I think that what Paul and his group have done is great and is a great model. And I would love there to be 3 or 4 or 5 other great models that I think people, states could look at or states could be involved in creating. I think to answer the question of who's to blame, I think it's, to a large extent, listen, I think there are some unscrupulous people out there using these topics for political gain in ways that are really harming our institutions. And I think that's true on the left, and I think that's true on the right. And I think, of course, there are also people who have very strongly held genuine beliefs on these issues. But I think that the vast majority of American adults and parents is quite in the middle on this and has reasonable views that I agree with about the proper role of schools, about what kinds of content should be covered. And I think that the extremists, they might be 10 or 15% on each side, but I don't think that they are reflective of what actually most Americans want their public schools to be doing.
Can I just reiterate a point I made up top, but mostly because I think it bears reinforcing. I don't think I can say this strongly enough. American education doesn't think this is its job. That's why I love to look from time to time at those mission and vision statements, because again, nobody plans their lessons around them, but it does say something about and by the way, what is the language it does appear, this college and career ready and whatnot. In other words, we have evolved into a conception of the role of public education as a private good. In other words, to prepare students for their private ends of career and college and whatnot. We've simply drifted so far from shore that we just don't see public education as having this responsibility anymore. So all of this is lovely to discuss, but until or unless we get ourselves back in the business of citizen making, I mean, I don't want to be unkind, but we're kind of talking to ourselves here, right? So then the question from a policy standpoint is, all right, how do you do that? And then that becomes quickly a case of be careful what you wish for. I've written voluminously about, while I'm not anti-testing, anti-accountability, there are problems with how test-driven accountability has really kind of broken reading instruction. So could we have, national tests in civics and citizenship? Sure. Well, would that be a good thing? I don't know. There's a mixed record. But I mean, beyond just what our pedagogical responsibilities are here, we should be also having a policy discussion about, and again, if Morgan's data is correct, and Americans want us to be in this business, okay, how do we make that happen? Because it's not happening right now. And again, I'm using the evidence of those mission statements. We just don't think this is our job anymore.
How important would you say institutional neutrality is for the schools themselves? And a very practical question, and it's a short question, so probably everyone could weigh in if they gave a quick answer, which is, should teachers, civics or otherwise, be in the business of having things in their classroom that make known their political views, whether it's something on the founders talking about Christianity or something about Black Lives Matter, reparations on the left, right? How should, in the classroom, should all of those sorts of things not be on the table, or where do you come down on that?
Yeah, I'll start. I mean, I don't think it's appropriate at all. And I've taught in classrooms that have Black Lives Matter flags, or we are the 1%, or we are the 99%, et cetera. And it just seems unprofessional to me. I've made this point elsewhere that, not a day goes by that you see, this kind of thing on, say, libs of TikTok, a teacher kind of abusing their classroom to behave performatively. And I always say, frankly, to my friends on the right, like, look, this is not indicative of 3.7 million American school teachers. However, if the culture of education were different, if we perceived ourselves as state actors, as public employees, then every teacher would automatically assume, well, of course, that's not appropriate. So I come back to the culture of education where people almost guilelessly think that there's nothing wrong with these kind of, bringing my whole self to the classroom. Well, maybe not if you're a state actor.
All
right.
right, we're close to the time. How about a quick response from the other two? Morgan, do you have a quick response?
Yeah. I was finally an area of disagreement. Well, maybe not disagreement, but agree with most of it. Listen, I'm a gay man, and when in the olden days, I was a gay teenager, and it would have meant a lot to me to have seen a rainbow flag in one of my teachers' classrooms. So I think that the question here is, what is the line between things that we think are appropriate and things that we think are not appropriate? And, I think that a rainbow flag means different things to different people. To some people, that is an expression of a view on LGBT rights. And to some people, that's just an expression of, I love you, my students, no matter who you are. And so I think, so I'm going to agree in part with what Robert said, but I'm also going to say it's not so obvious what the line is there between what's okay and what's not okay, and different people will disagree on that.
Totally fair.
I have to say, about when people put up the Ukrainian flag, I didn't feel terribly bad about it. But Paul, can you put up a Ukrainian flag?
The seventh theme of the EAD recommended roadmap of 7 themes does talk about contemporary debates and contemporary possibilities. I would anchor that in the theme number 4, the Constitution, a new government and a constitution. There's a new book coming from Yuval Levin of AEI coming out in June, American Covenant, about the American Constitution designed to force us to argue with each other. You separate and distribute powers. You have a national, federal level of government. You have state, local level of government. It's all designed to force argument, to force peaceful negotiation, consensus, compromise. Should gay rights be a topic in a high school civics classroom? Sure, as long as religion in America is also a topic in an American civics and history classroom, because they're right. Questions of individual rights and liberties, questions of the religious origins of American political constitutional thought and religious dimension, those are crucial. So to show that Michael's question of neutrality, to show a kind of Socratic quality anchored in the reality and complexity of American history and civics, but for it be very hard, as long as Robert's earlier point, as long as it's very hard for anyone to say, I can tell what the views of the teacher are.
Well, I'm going to take pride in offering a literal live example of how to conduct civic education. We've just done it. Thank you very much. I think it's been a wonderful opportunity to share a range of views, but to find that the range is within limits. And so thank you all very much. For the conference, the next session is coming up in 1 week from today at the same time. It's going to talk about teacher unions and their relationship to student learning in the classroom. So we have an excellent panel, Kira Jones, Michael Lobenheim, Melissa Lyon as our panelists, and we look forward to having you all with us 1 week from today. Thank you very much.
Thanks, folks.
Thank you.